Welcome, everyone. The title of the lecture tonight is the Psalm Code. We are going to be looking at the images in Genesis, some of the core images in Genesis as they appear in the Psalms. So that's a bit of a tight technical focus, but it's very interesting. It's interesting to me, at least. I hope it'll be interesting to you. And it's one of the things that really I love about this topic is that when you unpack the images, especially the images in Genesis 1 and 2, you can see how they are just everywhere throughout the Bible. So as I've gotten into this line of study, I've seen how there was just a whole lot of meanings in the Bible, a whole lot of layers of density and richness that I was just never seeing. So then I started to look at some of these, look at the Bible on the level of images and how those play out through literary devices. And the Bible, the richness of the Bible just began to unfold and unfold and unfold. So we're going to look at three of those images tonight. These core images that run throughout the whole Bible. And we'll look at them in where they appear in Genesis 1 and 2, and then how they're treated in some of the Psalms. Those images are the Garden of God, the Sea of Chaos, and the Mountain of Refuge. So the three core images: water in the Bible, gardens in the Bible, and mountains in the Bible. And we could talk for hours and hours about any one of these images. So I'm giving the disclaimer now. It is a surfacey lecture. We're like skimming across the top of the Bible like a stone skipping across the water. So consider yourself disclaimed. So before we get into the meat of the images, I just want to say some introductory things about the approach to the Bible I'll be using. So this is kind of some fundamental stuff. We're going to set the table and then put the food on it. So basically, that boils down to two ideas. First, the Bible is ancient. It's an ancient document. That might seem self-explanatory, but there's a lot there that we can look at. And the second thing I want to talk about by way of introduction is the Bible is literary. So the Bible is ancient, the Bible is literary. What do I mean when I say the Bible is ancient? And what challenges might that fact present modern readers uniquely that pre-modern readers, they didn't have those challenges? I want to read a quote real quick from The Lost World of Adam and Eve. This is by John Walton. So Walton writes, "As people who take the Bible seriously, we are obligated to read it for what the human communicator conveys to us about what God was revealing. The human communicator is going to do that in the context of his native cognitive environment. Our procedure then, as serious Bible readers, is first to set aside our own cultural assumptions as much as we're able, and then try to read the text for what it is saying." Walton goes on to say, "It takes a degree of discipline as readers who are outsiders to that time and place, not to assume our modern perspectives and impose them on the text. But we often don't even know we're doing it because our own context is so intrinsic to our thinking, and the ancient world is an unknown." So that's the end of the quote. There's a lot there. There's a lot there. When I really started to come to those ideas, it opened my eyes to ways that I was bringing my own modern assumptions into the text as if it was written in my lifetime. Because you don't feel the differences when you go to a different culture, let alone a different culture that is separated from you by millennia. So I just want to unpack that quote. Again, we're starting with some introductory stuff. So Walton is saying a few things. First thing he's saying is we are bringing more to our reading of the text than we're aware of. When we bring those assumptions, they don't come with wearing bells, like they just slip in. The Bible came out of a foreign time and a foreign place, and more than that, it was written on the other side of a chasm that scholars call modernity. It was written by pre-modern people, and the transition from pre-modernity to modernity has involved immense changes in how people conceive of the universe, of God, of the nature of the material world, as well as the non-material world, of themselves, and so on. So many things about what is taken for granted about reality have changed since the Bible was being written. But for better or worse, we moderns think like moderns, and we make the assumptions about reality that moderns make. And if you're not careful, you can bring those assumptions straight into the Bible unannounced and draw some different conclusions. So that's one thing. We bring more to the text than we're aware of. The second thing Welton is saying is that God accommodated his communication to the world of the text's original readers. Okay, that's a bit of a mouthful, so let me unpack that. Welton is saying God operated within the way the original readers and writers of the text of the Bible conceived of the universe. So they had ideas about reality, and God, he's both bringing wisdom from outside of their ideas of reality and also operating within their ideas about reality. The things he was communicating made sense to them. He spoke their language, so to speak, drew his communication out of the encyclopedia of their cultural milieu, out of their imagination, their common culture. He chose images to reveal himself to them in ways that made sense to them. You can think about how agrarian Jesus's parables were when he was walking around with agrarian people. So he's talking about seeds, he's talking about a vine, he's talking about a vineyard. He's accommodating his teaching, which is not limited to reality. It's from beyond reality and beyond time into reality, so that people can actually understand what he's saying. And even then, it was hard. So we're bringing more to the text than we're aware of. God accommodates his communication to his hearers. Last thing Welton is saying, I'm kind of extrapolating some principles from this quote that I read. The Bible was written for us. It's for us, but it wasn't written to us. It's to someone else. So that might be a challenging thought at first. But here's what he's saying. I think, in a sense, Welton is saying that though the Bible, it really was written for us. We can open the pages of the Bible and hear God's word for us. It was not to us. It's such an important thing to wrap our heads around if we want to approach the text as an ancient document. So the first step is you have to try to understand what it meant for those to whom it was written. You immerse yourself in the meanings of the ancient text in the ancient world, and you can let them kind of align and subvert and bend and expand your own set of mental images. And after that work is done, or while that work is being done, then you try to figure out what it means for us, for you. Okay, here's another facet of the fact that the Bible is ancient. Meanings change. That might also seem self-explanatory, but the original readers and writers of the books of the Bible shared a lot more with one another than we share with them, culturally, cognitively. Even writers who were 1,000 years apart, like you can think about people who were around when, like, the historical books of David were being put together, and the letters of Paul. There's a big gap of time separating those people. They would share a lot more than we share with Paul, because of some of the things I've already said about just how meanings change over time, especially across the gap of modernity. So I wanted to. This is I'm going to have a little bit of fun here, but we're looking at water, garden, mountain. How have the meanings of those things changed? Water in the Bible. The image that always comes to mind when I think about what is the meaning of water in the Bible is Noah's Ark. So there's this little boat, big chaotic sea that's killing everything. I did some Googling a while ago and found, I was just trying to find a good ad that kind of summed up how we feel about the sea. And I found a Corona ad. You've probably seen Corona ads before. It's this guy in a laid back chair. He's got a lime there. He's got his Corona, his cell phone rings, and he decides to pick it up and then I'll just throw it into the sea. And the blurb was, "Find your beach." So there's this sense that those are two very different understandings of the sea. Dark, danger, chaos, death. We are safe because we're not in the sea. Versus find your beach, which really means find the real you. Like, come have this vacation. Set your worries aside. This is a place of peace, not a place of danger. Mountains in the Bible. I think one of the archetypal mountains in the biblical imagination is Mount Sinai, the mountain of the law. Israel, there's like lightning and thunder and the voice of God, and Israel was terrified. And if you came too close to it, you died. And they did not want to go out. I found a North Face ad that showed this well-equipped woman hiking fearlessly through this mist-shrouded mountain. And the tagline says, "Worry is for the poorly equipped." So those are very different things going on there as far as understandings about mountains go. Modernity, this North Face hiker, has been rendered fearless by the powers of modernity. She had nothing to fear. She could climb straight up the mountain. She was ready. She wasn't poorly equipped. Ancient gardens. I found a Roundup ad that said, "Where there's a weed, there's a way." So these days, anybody can have a garden. And we have the technology to make that a basically perfect garden. There's no garden free of weeds. Just spray some of this stuff on it. Where there's a weed, there's a way. Gardens were not that in the ancient world. Thinking about one of the 7 wonders of the world, the Hanging Gardens of Babylon. So gardens were especially in the Middle Eastern mind, where in the Middle Eastern life, where water was not always a guarantee. The Hanging Gardens of Babylon, where they were the king's space. No one could go there. Everyone could see it up there. A mountain, a tower, overflowing with rich vegetation. That's how artists depict it. Partly because it took a lot of wealth to have that much water, and so it was this visible sign of wealth. Not for everybody. We couldn't. You couldn't just walk in there, and it was high. All of these things. When we get to gardens in a minute, we'll be ringing some bells there. Okay, so I'm almost through my introduction. The Bible is ancient. The Bible is literary. That's the second thing. And then we're going to we can just talk about some of this stuff, have a little Q&A, and then jump into mountain gardens in the Bible. So what does it mean that the Bible is literary? I think it's important to give a disclaimer that I'm not saying that the Bible is only literary. To understand the Bible as literature isn't to say it's only literature, as opposed to sacred scripture, the authoritative word of God. What I'm saying there is that it can be sacred scripture, the authoritative word of God, expressed even with it has a literary dimension, which when you start to dig into some of that, you actually, that's where a lot of the richness is. Now, modern scholarship has often sought to separate the two, like it being sacred scripture from it being literature, as if you could have more of one and less of the other only. But that's just not what the Bible is. The Bible is very, very rich literature, and God wanted it that way and made it that way, and has buried his rich meanings in the literary levels also. So literature, we could talk a lot about what literature is. I'm boiling it down to 3 things. Literature employs literary effects. For example, brevity, symbolism, and allusion. So these brevity, symbolism, and allusion. The Bible's full of all of those 3. So brevity means briefness. It's saying something quickly. The Bible, and especially Genesis, packs dense layers of meaning into a small amount of text. So when we approach the text, you really have to read it many times to start to get some of those dense, rich layers. And as we look into Genesis and the Psalms tonight, that's where we're headed. You may feel at times like I'm making a bigger deal out of smaller details, and even maybe coming to a few conclusions that are bigger than what the text can bear. But that's the way it's written. There's so much packed into the details. There's which direction the temple faces, where the river, so many details about the river in Eden, the carvings at the top of the temple pillars, how wet is the grave in the Hebrew imagination. All of these little details begin to emerge, and they're actually the source of great meaning. So brevity, symbolism. Symbolism is just figurative way to use language for one thing to represent another. So God is my rock is a symbolic language. I am like those who go down to the pit. That is the psalmist using symbolism to talk about death. So we understand that God is not a rock and death is not really a pit. But there are things about God and about death that are like a rock in a pit. So God is kind of embedding his meanings in these symbols, in the images. And tonight we'll specifically be looking at the symbolism in the geography of Genesis 1 and 2, the geography and the topography. What's higher? What's lower? What's separated? What's brought together? All these meanings are kind of contained in the biblical cosmology, the cross-section of creation. And the biblical writers saw it all. And they took those little tidbits of geography, the meanings embedded in them, and wove those meanings into their own later works. Last thing, and then we will have a just brief Q&A. We'll have a longer Q&A at the very end. Allusion and repetition. That's the third, one of the three main literary effects that the Bible employs a lot. And the texts of the Bible they're just in constant conversation with one another, both forward and back. Later texts hearken back to and draw meaning from previous texts. So the Psalms draw meaning from Genesis. And later writers build upon and expand meanings found in the very texts which have shaped their own imaginations. So the psalmists' imaginations were shaped by Genesis. They wrote Genesisly. They speak the language of the images they learned. And it works the other way too. Later texts reveal meanings that were always there. So it's almost like the meaning works backward from the later text. We'll see that a couple times tonight. And this is especially true of Genesis, which is the keystone text in the biblical imagination. So the ideas and the images of Genesis stock the biblical imagination and produce this mental encyclopedia of associations and meanings that later writers draw from. It's like square one. That's the foundation. Okay, so before we get into water and then gardens and then mountains, let's just have a quick pause. I'd love to hear from you. How's this sitting with you so far? Is there anything you want to raise your hand on and clarify or delve briefly more deeply into? Or we can just plunge ahead. Yeah, Lena.
So, can you guys hear me?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So I love what you're saying. Just a question that I have though, because you said that, the Bible is ancient and it's also literary. And to me, the Bible is a document that is trying to explain not just the story of God over time, but also God himself is revealing things. So is it possible, two things, is it possible that the reason why you have, Genesis is almost like God is setting this picture, this foundation literarily, I don't know if that's a term, but is it possible that the great mysteries of God that he is trying to unveil can only be fully understood in a non-direct literary way? So like, for instance, if I say love, and that's all I say, like I could write that down and you could read it and you'll have an understanding, but that's totally different than if I tell you a story and I give you imagery in different areas that like speak to that. And also you said that, it's also, you think you have to think about it in the context of who it's written to and the culture of that time. Is it also possible that because this is somewhat orchestrated by a God who is both before time, after time, and in time at the same time, is it possible that what he's also doing is the great literary pictures are for that time, but also there are things in it that he knew can be unveiled even now? Like there's new understandings that he knew, he like put in there like a seed, like he planted it, and he knew that only in this season like it would come out. and be understood in a different way. And again, that only works if you have a literary or a pictorial or themes that, that he's putting in there rather than just words, that you write down.
Yeah, those are some good thoughts. You said a lot there. I liked it. Let me just follow up on a few comments, a few themes in what you said. You're talking about the richness of image and story. It seems to be something God likes. This is he revealed himself in many ways in the pages of the Bible and outside of the pages of the Bible. Some of those ways within the pages of the Bible are very propositional. Think about the Ten Commandments, the Proverbs, the historical writings. This is a narrative. Some of them are more poetic, like the Psalms would be an obvious place you could go there. But also Genesis. There is some. It's not modern poetry, but it has poetic literary elements, and I think it's hard to look over the fence into the mind of God. So I won't do that. But it does make sense to me that poetry is a tool that can really pack dense meanings into a short amount of text. God could have written giant instruction manual, written out in legalese that could not possibly be misinterpreted. But he seems to have given his revelation in a time release format, in a sense. Like, you get these images inside you, and then you think about them, and they do something to you. That's what we'll look at Psalm 1 in a little bit. That's what God is saying through the writer of Psalm 1 is the way it works. Like, the man who meditates on the Torah day and night is like a tree planted by streams of water, and the leaves never wither and the fruit is unfailing. So there's this sense of I can take these images and the ideas inside them and the meanings inside them inside myself, and they sprout. And there is a richness that comes there. And you see that in Jesus too. He's kind of maybe, Lena, one of the things you're saying is similar to Jesus's approach with the parables. Here's this being who is God, infinitely ancient and wise, the perfect teacher, and he's saying stuff people don't understand. And he kind of says, well, he who has ears to hear, let him hear. So there's this, he gives them stories that do have this time release richness to them. And the disciples remember the stories and then weave them into their own works that we get to interact with Jesus's stories in the four Gospels. Lena, you said other good things. They have slipped out of my mind, but we can all go listen to them again in the recording and be refreshed. I'm going to just address one other thing, and then I'm going to keep going in the interest of time. Drew, you dropped into the chat. What do you mean the Bible is written for us, but not to us? So I started this lecture with a quote from John Walton. That's a John Walton line. The Bible is written for us, but not to us. And it's kind of talking about time. The Bible was not written to Andy Patton. I am a much later. I've entered the game later. The Bible was written to others who are ancient, more ancient than me. So it's the two-ness, like I should not expect modern idiom and modern meanings and modern associations in an ancient document. I would expect that if it was written to me, but it wasn't written to me. However, the Bible was written for me also. So it can be written to that person in a particular time, a particular place, or group of people in this case, namely the Israelites and others, and depending on what book and time we're talking about, it can be written in a particular way to that group and have me in mind, in a sense, even though it's particularized and universal, so that I can come to it. I'm still a human being in God's reality, who God is working in, using his meanings in his Bible to change me. So it's for me. It is for me, but it wasn't to me. Drew, that's just me riffing on your question. If you want to dive into that more, John Walton has written a lot about it. He's got a lot of books. Just look up John Walton, The Lost World of, and there's a whole Lost World series. Okay, let's move on. We'll have a more extensive Q&A at the end. Let's jump into really the meat of what we've come for tonight. The water in the Bible, gardens in the Bible, mountains in the Bible. Just a quick aside before we do that. My friend Philip and I edit a newsletter called Three Things. You can find it at threethingsnewsletter.substack.com. I don't say that to plug my newsletter. I only say that to say that if you like this lecture, it turned into a 6-part course on 3 things. So just go there, and you can dive into each of these symbols. Gets 2 hours a piece. In this lecture, they're going to get about 7 minutes. So, which means we're moving fast. Water in the Bible. Don't answer, but just think about this for a second. What is the first mention of water in the Bible? Just think on that for a moment. First mention of water in the Bible. Did you think of the flood? It's pretty early. Starts in Genesis 6, wrapped up by Genesis 9. There's an earlier mention. It is the earliest mention of anything. Genesis 1 and 2. Let me just read it. Genesis 1 and 2. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. The earth was without form and void, and darkness was over the face of the deep. And the Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the waters. So I caught at least 2 references to water there. You've got the Spirit of God hovering over the face of the waters, and darkness over the face of the deep. That word deep is a watery, that's a deep ocean. It's the Tehom, or that in Hebrew, it's the Tehom, sometimes translated in English as the abyss or the deep. This is a dense image. It speaks of the earth as those words, without form and void, tohu babohu, without form and void. Those are sometimes also translated as wild and waste. It's this weird double image of it's wasteland, but it is watery. There's an ocean here. There's a deep ocean. This speaks to, in a sense, the fact that this is one of those. The Bible is an ancient document. Okay, in the ancient mind, the uncreated state is not nothing. That's a modern thing. We know about vacuums and outer space, and it's easy, and we've got this Big Bang theory, and before the Big Bang was nothing, energy rays. That's not, they didn't know that. That's not what they thought. They thought of the uncreated state as a chaotic ocean. So in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth was without form, it was wild and waste, and darkness was over the face of the uncreated nothingness, unordered. But the Spirit of God was there, hovering over the waters. So you have this ball of chaotic ocean, this chaos, but the Spirit is there, poised to do something. That's the opening note of the Bible, the opening crescendo. So what is he going to do? If the uncreated state is a chaotic state, Genesis 1 tells the story of the ordering of the chaos. We begin with the sea of chaos. And then Genesis 1, 6 through 8, before this, God creates light. And then we pick up, and God said, let there be an expanse in the midst of the waters, and let it separate the waters from the waters. Verse 7, and God made the expanse, which is a Hebrew word, rakia, and separated the waters that were under the rakia from the waters that were above the rakia. And it was so. And God called the rakia sky. And there was evening and there was morning the second day. What's going on here? So first God makes light, and then God separates the water vertically. So separates, there's waters above and there's waters below. And he kind of pushes the waters above up, above this rakia, which is often translated as expanse or firmament. And I don't love those translations because I think it's too easy for us to get, just sidetracked with modern thinking. We think of space as a great expanse. It must have been space because that's what's up there. They didn't think like that. They didn't know about space. They hadn't seen the earth from from a satellite like we have, where it's just got this thumbnail atmosphere, and then beyond it, the darkness, the dark expanse. They just saw blue, and water sometimes fell from the blue. So they thought, well, what's holding the water up? It's the roof, it's the rakia. So God enters into this chaotic ocean, and he begins work of separating. He separates the waters above from the waters below, the earth waters from the sky waters. And you can kind of see where this is coming from with the ancient imagination, because there's that water comes from up there. And when you dig down deep enough, you find water there too. And sometimes it bubbles up in springs and rivers. So the land is between waters in the biblical imagination. There's a lot more we could say about this, and we'll this isn't our last stop in Genesis tonight. But let me just go on. This is the teaser hook. Where are the sea monsters in the Bible? Here they are, Genesis 1, 20 and 21. God said, again, before I read this, we are building our mental imagination of what is water in the Bible, and that takes us back to Genesis, where it starts. So Genesis 1, 20 and 21. And God said, let the waters swarm with swarms of living creatures, and let birds fly above the earth across the expanse of the heavens. So God created the great sea creatures and every living creature that moves, with which the waters swarm, according to their kinds, and every winged bird according to its kind. And God saw that it was good. So did you notice there that God makes two things in the sea, the great sea creatures and everything else, all the other fish, and everything that lives and moves in the waters, with which the waters swarm. Why? What's going on with these great sea creatures then that they don't count as one of the fish? Why two categories? So that word, which is translated in English as great sea creatures, is tanin in Hebrew. And it can also be translated as serpent or dragon. So this is the appearance of a sea monster, basically. And it is in seed form, an image, the planting of a seed that will grow throughout the pages of the Bible and will recur, and it's part of a larger trajectory for an image of evil in the Bible. If you fast forward all the way to Revelation, and there's this line that says, that old serpent, dragon, Satan, the devil. So it's a bunch of titles strung together, and one of them is a dragon, one of them is a serpent. That is the fruition of the narrative arc of this moment, this chaos monster, this sea monster, that starts here, and it appears in lots of other places in the Bible that we will not look at. But if you listen to this in course form on three things, you can. I go into it a bit more there. What's going on here? This is a bit of a, I'm going to skip this part. Listen to the course. I'll send all of you a link to the first bit where I go into how this might be related to the alternate creation stories of Israel's pagan contemporaries. What did the Canaanites think creation was like? What did the Assyrians and the Egyptians and the Babylonians think? And there's a clue, teaser, that it involves sea monsters often. So this is kind of polemics. I'm going to skip that for the sake of time. For each of these images, I'm just going to talk about what's going on in Genesis 1 and 2 with water, with gardens, with the mountains. And then we're going to fast forward to the Psalms. So how, if that's the anchor of the image, how is it developed in the Psalms? So let's look at a few Psalms. I'll be really skipping around. And if you're here because you're into the rabbit room, but you don't really know the Bible, it's going to feel like whiplash a little bit, but it's all recorded. I'll say the numbers. You can go read them on your own. First theme that the psalmists really highlight about water in the Bible is that God rules the waters of chaos. So we have water as a not only a chaotic, evil, dark, and dangerous image. There's two versions of water in the Bible: life and death. We're not talking about the life one right now. We're talking about the sea of chaos. So let's just keep pursuing that thread. So there's this chaotic water, this water as an image of chaos and death and danger. The psalmists take pains to say this chaos is not bigger than God. In fact, God rules it. Psalm 29, verse 3, verse 10. The voice of the Lord is over many waters. The Lord sits enthroned over the flood. Do you see any echoes with the imagery of Genesis 1? Just take a moment there and think about it. The voice of the Lord is over the many waters. The Lord sits enthroned over the flood. If you just thought of where we started with the Spirit hovering over the chaotic waters, that's right on. This is a reference to that. It's evoking this primacy of God over waters, which represents evil and death and danger. It's saying something about his power. Here's another thing, another echo, Genesis echo here. The voice, what is it over the many waters? The voice of the Lord. In the Genesis story, which is contrary to the creation stories of Israel's contemporaries, God doesn't battle anything. He doesn't, his creation happens by voice. He just speaks. It's the act of creation and ordering of the chaotic waters is accomplished by God's voice. Okay, let's move on. Psalm 104, 5 through 9. Let me just read these verses. God set the earth on its foundations so that it should never be moved. You covered it with the deep as with a garment. The waters stood above the mountains. At your rebuke, they fled. At the sound of your thunder, they took to flight. The mountains rose, the valleys sank down to the place you appointed for them. You set a boundary that they may not pass, and so that they may not cover the earth again. So here again, we have echoes of creation. The story of the earth begins in the sea, but the voice and rebuke of God pushes them back, separates them. Verse 7, at your rebuke, the waters fled. At the sound of your thunder, they took to flight. And notice that in the psalmist's retelling of Genesis 1, which is really what this part of Psalm 104 is, it's a retelling of the steps of creation. The waters don't sink down until the land is revealed, but the land rises up out of the deep in the form of mountains. So God is bringing his mountain up out of the sea of chaos, that's the image. That's what we should be imagining when we read Genesis 1, that there is a God's mountain like Hawaii, just rushing up out of this sea of chaos. So let's talk about the sea monsters in the Psalms. This image, I said a moment ago, this image appears elsewhere in the Bible. Let's look at a few moments. Psalm 89, 9 and 10. The psalmist writes, you rule the raging sea. When its waves rise, you still them. You crushed Rahab like a carcass. You scatter your enemies with your mighty arm. Where are the sea monsters there? There's a lot going on with the word Rahab. It's not the woman who helped the spies in the book of Joshua. It's the name of a mythical sea monster. So Rahab is the name of a sea monster. It's also a euphemism for Egypt, one of the ancient evil empires in the biblical landscape. It also sounds like the word for storm, which is the realm of the Canaanite god Baal. Baal was a big feature in one of the bad guys in the Israelite imagination because he was the god of the people they were locked in conflict with for a big part of their history. So the psalmist is plucking this sea monster image and saying, God rules. God flings the body of this sea monster like a carcass. You scatter your enemies with your mighty arm. The psalmist is trying to say something about God's power, even over the forces of evil at their most potent. And he reaches for this image of this sea monster. You can look at Psalm 74, 13 and 14 again. Let's look at it. So this is Psalm 74. You divided the sea by your might and broke the heads of the sea monsters on the waters. You crushed the heads of Leviathan. That's Psalm 74, 13 and 14. Psalm 74 it's in a sense a post-apocalyptic psalm. God's temple has been destroyed. It lies in ruins. The sanctuary has been burned and profaned. That's in the narrative of the psalm. That's what's happening. It's also interesting to note that the destroyers of the temple in that psalm are described in a curious way. They're basically described as lumberjacks. So they are swinging axes, in quote, swinging axes in a forest of trees. Why are there trees in the temple? We'll get there in a second. So in the midst of this terrible scene, this post-apocalyptic scene of devastation that the psalmist is describing, he expresses the power of God by remembering that it was God who divided the sea, separating the waters above from the waters below. God who created the sea monsters and who rules the sea monsters. And remember, we're not talking about sea monsters. We're talking about evil, who rules them. So God's enemies are cast as the monsters of chaos. And you can see why a psalm like this might be very comforting to people who saw the destruction of the temple, who saw their enemies come in and lay waste to the lives that they had built. And were asking, where's God in all this? So this is the work that arises out of those experiences. All right, I'm going to skip the bit about the water of death for the sake of time. So the Psalms I was going to look at were Psalm 18, verse 4 through 5, and Psalm 88, 4 through 7. If you are reading the Psalms and you come across water, you are either in good luck or you have good luck or you're about to die. Like it is a dual image of life and death. Psalm 18 and Psalm 88 are good examples of that. We're going to move on to let's do mountains. So again, for each of these, we'll spend a little bit of time on the Genesis image. What is the origin story of this image? And then we'll move on to the Psalms and how is it developed in the Psalms. In Genesis 1, verse 9 and 10, the first mountain appears. It says, "And God said, let the waters under the heavens be gathered together in one place, and let the dry land appear." The dry land is the Yabashah in Hebrew. So this is God has separated the waters vertically. Remember, we talked about that already. So he starts with the undifferentiated, chaotic waters, dark, introduced light, separated them vertically, and here he's separating them horizontally. And the land, the dry land appears. I've always imagined this as kind of like parting the Red Sea. Like there's these walls of water on either side, and down there is like the flat, dry land. I grew up in a very flat place. I don't think that. I think that was wrong. That's not how we should be imagining this moment. And some of that is based on Psalm 104. Remember, the waters stood above the mountains, and the mountains emerged through them. So I think now when I read Genesis 1 through 9, I imagine the dry land appearing, almost erupting out of the surface of the mountain. Okay, what's happening here? I think in terms of the meaning, we talked about the image. In terms of the meaning, Genesis 1 begins with this dark, chaotic water, and God then, step by step, creates a refuge from the waters of chaos and death. He's bringing order and space for the first half of Genesis 1, days 1, 2, and 3. For the next work of creation he's about to do in days 4, 5, and 6. Some people call this forming. He forms the space. And then the second half of Genesis 1, days 4, 5, and 6, he fills the space with life. But first he has to push back the forces of chaos and evil. So that's one thing to note. The dry land in Genesis 1 is a mountain. And then moving forward to Genesis 2, we have the Garden of Eden. The Garden of Eden is introduced. More detail is given. And I just want to say that I believe that Eden, we should also be imagining Eden as a mountain, which is a bit of a new idea for a lot of people. As I've talked with people about these ideas, that's the one, for some reason, that everybody's like, hang on, time out. That is not what I imagine when I imagine Eden. A mountain? Why is it at the top of a mountain? So let's just look at that for a second. Some of that is what I just said. It's founded on the land that rose up out of the sea, symbolically, God's mountain, which presides over the sea of chaos. So some of that's related to like the image itself, as later writers work with it. Some of it has to do with geography. If you read Genesis 2 closely, you can see that a river flows from Eden through the garden and splits into 4 and flows into the other lands. So gravity being what it is, rivers flow down. So Eden must be higher than the other lands on this cosmic mountain. Third point about this, why is Eden a mountain, is the prophets. Some of the prophets, for instance, Ezekiel 28, the prophet writes about the garden of God, and the next breath he calls it the mountain of God. So it's kind of like, which is it? Is it the garden of God or is it the mountain of God? And the answer is, it is yes, it is both. The garden of God is the mountain of God. In Joel 2, the prophet talks about Zion, my holy mountain, and the land around it is likened to the Garden of Eden. So there's this kind of switching back and forth until the images blur into one. And there's also just the fourth thing that makes me think that Eden is a garden is it's just this concatenation of images. Concatenation is just a word that means the coming together of many things, like the way the spokes of a bike wheel come together at the hub. So a bunch of images meet at a garden mountain. Now, for instance, the temple, the place of meeting with God, is decked out in jungle garden decorations because it's symbolically linked to Eden, the first place that humanity met with God. So that's one of the spokes coming back to this same hub. The temple is literally on top of a mountain in Jerusalem, a fortress city, a high refuge. Symbolically, Jerusalem is Mount Zion. Mount Zion is God's cosmic mountain, which has no place, but is a idea. It's also Jerusalem. It's used both ways in the Bible. And all these images come together in the same spot. So you can kind of imagine a gem with many facets. You turn it this way, it looks like a temple. You turn it that way, it looks like a garden. You turn it the other way, it looks like a mountain, a fortress. It's the same thing. Which one is it? Yes, it is all of them. So that's the Genesis, the roots of the Genesis image of the mountains in the Bible. What did the psalmist do with that? The first thing that, if you've read much of the Psalms, you will notice is, God is a rock, and that rock is a refuge. So a refuge from the chaos waters. Think of Psalm 18, 1 and 2, and 16. Psalm 18 begins, I love you, Lord, O Lord, my strength. The Lord is my rock and my stronghold and my deliverer, my God, my rock, in whom I take refuge, my shield, the horn of my salvation, my stronghold. He sent, this is verse 16, he sent from on high and he took me. He drew me out of the many waters. And verse 3 and 4 of Psalm 18 are just about drowning, basically. So there's these two, this chaos waters and the rock, the mountain refuge, contrasted with one another. And God is the one who rescues from danger and evil, symbolically stated as a mountain. So what's going on here? You've got verse 2, rock, stronghold, rock, stronghold. In English, it reads it's a bit of a stilted reading. In Hebrew, those are 4 words, not 2 words. They're all different words that might be better translated as like crag, cliff, fortress, high refuge. So the psalmist is really just bringing in all of his literary tricks to just paint this dense image of height, altitude, and strength and protection. So that's Psalm 18. One of the more memorable moments of God as a mountain. Psalm 46, 1 and 3. Here you have the roots of the Genesis image again coming in. Verse 1, 2, and 3. God is our refuge and strength, a very present help in trouble. Therefore we will not fear, though the earth gives way, though the mountains be moved into the heart of the sea, though its waters roar and foam, and the mountains tremble at its swelling. So this is a very tight picture of uncreation. So it's here you have the steps of Genesis 1, starts as chaos, separated, mountain rises up, life happens, reversed. So it's a reversal of the creation process. The mountains fall into the sea, and the sea closes around them again, and they roar and foam. We're back to the chaos waters. But the psalmist is saying, God is so my refuge that even if, this is my post-apocalyptic imagery, even if civilization topples, I will be safe because God is my refuge and my strength, a very present help in times of trouble. So you can see how the psalmist is trying to say something and reaches in his cultural bag of tricks, images and meanings, and what comes out is even if the mountains fall into the sea, I will be safe because I have God. Next point, mountains. The mountain is also a temple. So there, like I said a minute ago, is it a mountain? Is it a temple? Yes. Where do I get that idea? Psalm 2, with Psalm 1, one of the kind of doorway to the Psalms, the introductory section, Psalm 1 and 2, writes, as for me, I have set my king on Zion, my holy hill. I will tell of the decree. The Lord said to me, you are my son. Today I have begotten you. The most quoted line in the New Testament. So this is this important psalm. And you see, I have set my king on Zion, my holy hill. So there's again, a concatenation of images. You have the throne, you have a kingship, you have Zion, Jerusalem, and it's not only a hill. By the way, the word for mountain and hill is the same in Hebrew. So it's my holy mountain. It is a holy mountain, a temple mountain. Psalm 24, who shall ascend the mountain of the Lord? Who shall stand in his holy place? That's 24:3, using the phrase holy place as temple language. The holy place in this psalm is pictured as being on top of God's mountain. And the answer to the psalm is, in the psalm, that question is phrased, and the answer given is the one who is completely pure. And then it's the bit where it starts talking about the ancient gate being lifted up so the King of glory can come in. It's a reversal of the exile of Genesis 3. But that's a digression. Psalm 48, and then we'll move on to the garden. Psalm 48, 1 and 2. Great is the Lord and greatly to be praised in the city of our God. His holy mountain, beautiful in elevation, is the joy of all the earth, Mount Zion. So again, you have, this is a holy city that is also a mountain. And it is the joy of all the earth. It is the place from which life comes. And that is very much an Eden image, an Eden moment. Okay, let's move on to the garden, and then we'll have a brief discussion. Let's rewind to the Genesis roots of the image of the garden. There's several features of Eden in Genesis 1 and 2 that are worth pointing out. Number one, the garden is on the east side of Eden. Genesis 2:8, and the Lord planted a garden in Eden, in the east. There he put the man he had formed. So I always tended to think of Eden and the garden as synonymous. They're the same thing, but that doesn't seem to be the case. But rather, God plants a garden in Eden on the eastern side. So there is a larger section and a smaller section within that section that is the garden, and that garden is on the eastern side. That is incredibly significant. I don't know if we'll go into it or not. Let me just give a brief aside so I don't leave that hanging. There is another structure in the Bible that is made of compartmentalized rooms as you move westward, becoming more holy. So that's how the temple was built. There's a lot of space given to the exact architecture of the temple and the tabernacle. They are rectangles, and you have the court, the holy place, and the most holy place, and the temple faces east. So as you walk westward into the temple, you enter the holier territory. That's all here in seed form. And the Lord God planted a garden in Eden in the east, and there he put the man he had formed. Number two, the tree of life was in the garden. So again, we're sorry for the garden pun, but we're digging up the garden, the roots of the garden in the Genesis 1 and 2. The tree of life is there. So Genesis 2:9 says the tree of life was in the midst of the garden. So there's Eden, the Lord plants a garden, the Lord puts humanity in there, and the tree of life is there. And the tree seems to have special life extending properties. On the image level, it is a tree, and you can eat of its fruit, and that fruit has life. It gives life. You can see this in Genesis 3, after Adam and Eve sinned. God says, we can't let them eat from the tree of life anymore. There is a separation from the garden and a separation from life. And that is the outworking of the death that was promised to them when they would if they'd eat of the tree of the other tree in the middle of the garden, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. So there is, the garden faces the east. The tree of life is there. There is a river there. Genesis 2:10, a river flowed out of Eden to water the garden, and there it divided and became 4 rivers. So remember, rivers flow down. So you have a river flowing from Eden into the garden, and in the garden it divides and becomes 4 rivers, and then flows down to the other lands. And there's a little aside in Genesis 2 about, here are the 4 rivers, here's where they go. So that means the garden is slightly lower than Eden. Again, we're kind of thinking topographically, and that is higher than everything else. Point number 4 about the garden here in Genesis. The Garden of Eden was the first temple. I've already said this a little bit, but there's all kinds of parallels between the tabernacle, which was the mini temple, mobile mini temple before the temple existed, and then the temple in Jerusalem and the Garden of Eden. And Moses and Solomon didn't have creative freedom. They couldn't riff on those structures. God designed those buildings, and it's not the most exciting bit of scripture to read because it's so exacting and particular. And that's because it was supposed to invoke Eden. So it had to look just this way. It had to face east. The temple was covered in gold and would have shined if you brought a light into it, because it's about God. It's supposed to be a lesson about God. The walls and the columns were covered in plants and floral designs. There were, like I said a moment ago, there's gradated levels of holiness as you move westward. The most holy room was a perfect cube. We see that appear again at the end of the book of Revelation. So what happens in the Psalms with this very rich garden stuff? Psalm 1:3. He is planted like a tree. He is like a tree planted by streams of water that yields its fruit in season, and its leaf does not wither. In all that he does, he prospers. So the first 2 verses of that psalm indicate that the he in that psalm is the man who delights in the law and meditates on it day and night. What is he like? He's like a tree planted by streams of water that yields its fruit in season, and its leaf doesn't wither. How is that about the tree of life? The tree of life is not specifically mentioned. It is mentioned elsewhere in the Bible. And when it's mentioned elsewhere in the Bible, you get these characteristics, these certain kind of markers. So you get its leaves never wither and its fruit never fails. And, it's always there in the proper season. So if you read those markers backward here, you have the person who meditates on the law of the Lord, who takes God's life inside him, his law inside him, is like a tree of life planted by, this miraculous tree yields its fruit in season, and its leaf does not wither. So unfailing fruit, unwithering leaves scream tree of life language. Also interesting to note, it's not planted by a stream of water, it's streams of water, multiple water courses. So again, it's the tree of life in Eden in Genesis 2 is by multiple water courses. And I think it's interesting to note that it doesn't say the student of Torah gets to eat from the tree, which is what you would expect if this is the tree of life, right? The Adam and Eve were exiled because God separated them from the fruits of the tree. It says in Psalm 1, the student of the Torah becomes the tree of life. It's as if the psalmist is saying, this is the way to eternal life now. If you can get this inside you, if you can meditate on it day and night, you will be the fruit-bearing thing. Your fruit, the fruit of your life, people can come and eat and live forever. I think that's going on in Psalm 1. That's maybe you'll recognize some of that idea from what Paul writes in New Testament letters about what coming into the church should be like. That you get the fruit of the Spirit. That the people should be characterized by this supernaturally beautiful characteristics: love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, gentleness, self-control. That there should be something miraculous that that can be shared with other people that makes them alive. All that is in Psalm 1. It's there, and it's all Genesis stuff. Okay, Psalm 92, another garden moment in the Psalms. 92, 12 through 14. The righteous flourish like a palm tree and grow like a cedar in Lebanon. They are planted in the house of the Lord. They flourish in the courts of our God. They still bear fruit in old age, and they're ever full of sap and green. We got some tree of life stuff here. Throughout Scripture, the house of the Lord is a reference to the temple. Remember, Mary and Joseph lose Jesus in Jerusalem for 3 days, and then they come back and find him, and he's in the temple, and he says, "Didn't you know I'd be in my Father's house?" You know, the house of the Lord is in the temple. So the structure in view, the righteous flourish like a palm tree and grow like a cedar in Lebanon. They're planted in the house of the Lord is the temple. Why is the temple full of trees? We've talked about this, mentioned this a little bit already. It's because it's supposed to be Eden. That's the psalmist gets that. The temple is, Eden doesn't reference the temple references Eden. Eden was the first hot spot, the point of contact between God and his creation, this place of peace and flourishing. And the righteous now are like these fruitful trees that Eden was full. You know, God gave Eden this rich abundance, and trees are very much a part of that. And righteousness in a human being is like that. It's like a step into Eden. They still bear fruit in old age. They're ever full of sap and green. Again, miraculous fruit, unfailing leaves, ever full of sap and green. Okay, next garden thing in the Psalms, the river of life. Psalm 46:4. There's a river whose streams make glad the city of God, the holy habitation of the Most High. So again, the city of God is Jerusalem, the habitation of the Most High. That's temple language. A temple is a place where the Most High, you know, God's inhabit them. They're enthroned in them. So you start to see these images converge and meld together. There's a river whose streams make glad the city of God. So we're talking about the river, which is evoking Eden. We're talking about throne and kingship and temple language. Psalm 36:7-9. How precious is your steadfast love, O God. The children of mankind take refuge in the shadow of your wings. They feast on the abundance of your house, and you give them drink from your river of delights, for with you is the fountain of life. So again, this is talking about God's house, temple language, and it's a place of abundance. This should now be a bit familiar, so that when you get one image, you get a couple of the others. It's a place of feasting for the people of God, as the Garden of Eden was. There's trees in the temple. There's a river flowing through it that people can drink from, and it's not a normal river. It is a river of delight. It is a fountain of life. Verse 9, for with you is the fountain of life. So there's this, again, I hope the point is becoming clearer and clearer. What this whole lecture is about is that the Genesis images have so shaped the biblical mind that if you want to understand Psalms, you got to go back to Genesis, because that is the well they're drawing from.